Hi, everyone. We're so delighted that you're joining us today for this event. I am William Crow. I'm the director of the Lehigh University Art Galleries and professor of practice in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Design. Thank you for joining us in this online experiment. Like many of you, we are all working remotely during this moment. And so we are experimenting with transitioning some of our in-person programs to an online format. I've always thought of museums as great places to virtually travel, to visit different places and different times and different cultures. And perhaps now that all comes even more into the spotlight since we are all looking to museums and other cultural organizations, at least online at the moment, to experience other things. The Art in Dialogue series is one that brings together faculty members in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Design with other experts from a wide range of departments at Lehigh University and the broader community, really as a means to make interdisciplinary connections and to see how works of art can really show us many ways of knowing about the world beyond an aesthetic lens. So I'm really excited about today's program. The exhibition was on view prior to this is the faculty exhibition in the main gallery of the Lehigh University Art Galleries. And while unfortunately the galleries are currently closed, we're excited to continue with these online programs. Maybe it had two turns prior to this. So I am going to introduce our speakers briefly. Anna Chupa is professor and chair in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Design at Lehigh University. And Anna teaches digital photography, digital textile design, and motion graphics, among other subjects. Her photography, her textile designs, quilts, and mixed media work have been exhibited globally, everywhere from Austria and China to Italy and Morocco and Spain, and of course here in the United States. Anna Chupa received her MFA in photography from the University of Delaware and a Master of Arts in Liberal Studies from Dartmouth. Nicholas Sawicki is an art historian who is teaching the history of modern art, and his principal area of research is early 20th century European modernism. Nick is a specialist in modern Czech art, and he's written extensively on the subject, as well as the history of exhibitions, periodicals, patronage, and transnational artistic exchange. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to turn things over. And as you can see on our agenda, we're going to really spend the bulk of our time with this presentation from Anna Chupa and dialogue with Nick Sawicki, but we will be saving some time for questions from participants starting at about 12:50 or so before we wrap up. So Anna, take the microphone whenever you're ready.
Okay. Well, Barcelona Impressions, and thank you, William, for that introduction. Barcelona Impressions is one of 4 quilts based on photography taken in Barcelona of modernist architecture. And modernism in Barcelona was Barcelona's version of Art Nouveau, but it also looked back at medieval architecture, Gothic architecture, and Mudéjar architecture, which was a combination of Spanish and Islamic influences, and also combined an interest in modernization with a look back at Catalan cultural traditions. Casa Santurce is one of the towers that I use on the left-hand side of this quilt. And I show you the whole building to give you a sense of context. But typically my photography is framing a detail, and I don't take a photograph for the composition. I take it for the detail that I might use in the montage that I create later. So I take the photograph of the building to just remember where I was when I come back. but the detail is what I'm really interested in. Here in Casa I used the chimneys from the rooftop. You can get access to the rooftop, and also the top floor of the building. So the top floor lines the interior top section of the quilt. And then the lower corner is where I have these sentinel figures that are the chimneys that you see in the middle of the top of the building. And then also from Catalan Culture, in 2018, when we were there, this was just after the 2017 referendum for Catalan independence. And there were Catalan flags everywhere in the balconies of buildings. Every corner we turned, we saw a Catalan flag. And so I incorporated that into this quilt. And then we didn't see the actual human towers called castels, but we saw toys in souvenir shops that were replicas of these human towers. So I've included the toy in this. And of course, Sagrada Familia is the skyline from any direction you see the towers. And to see this viewpoint of this detail, you have to take an elevator up and climb a spiral staircase, cross the bridge in dizzying heights to see the details of the mosaics on the tower, the Gloria Tower. And Gaudi didn't like Gothic arches because they depended on buttresses, which he thought were ugly. He used the catenary arch and the parabolic arch instead. And this is what his attic looked like, the Casa Bayo attic that he designed. And there are attics in other buildings that use the catenary arch as well. And finally, this building, the tower of Casa Josefa Villanueva. This building originally was supposed to be symmetrical with towers on both sides and galleries in between. But over time with the renovations, the symmetry was destroyed and this is the only tower that's left. Aviary Queen is the second of the quilts in the series. And the three quilts that have these gigants or giants in the quilts are so named because of these puppets. They are worn by people. The head would be in that middle crisscross area. That's where the person would see out. And you can see the scale relative to the shop window in the back. This one I called Aviary Queen because of the bird cage that makes the torso in this particular puppet. Her wings merge into the arbor that was part of Gaudi's garden in Park Güell. And Park Güell was originally intended to be a housing complex, but the city didn't fund it and didn't approve it. So the only two houses in Park Güell were Güell's house and the house that Gaudi lived in. From Palau de la Música, I've used the roses that are on top of the columns, but I wanted to also show you the view of the whole of the interior. To show you how Luis Domènech y Montaner used a lot of light in his buildings and how light really is dominant in his architecture. So in addition to stucco and plaster roses, I use stone flowers and iron flowers surrounding the giant figure. And I used the tower of Casa de la Punches as an extension of her headdress. And Casa de los Punches is only a fragment of the tower. I use that later in another quilt. So Gaudi Queen is called Gaudi Queen not because of the architecture in the background, but because of her head. Her head is modeled to look like one of Gaudi's chimneys. And the Gaudi King, it's a king and queen pair, also has a Gaudi chimney. In the upper right-hand corner, I have a tower from Casa Rocamora, and I also have part of the spine that's called the dragon spine from Casa Bayo. And it curves along the spine of the rooftop. And the scales, you can see a little bit of the scales on the right-hand side of that image, form the dragon scales. It's an allusion to St. George and the dragon, the patron saint of Barcelona. And the only fragment from Palau Güell that I use is one of the brick chimneys on the rooftop, and that extends from her head. The more dominant architecture that's in the Gaudi Queen is from São Paulo, and also Domenic y Montaner. And this was an elaborate hospital that was a hospital for charity for the poor, and quite striking. And I used the color scheme from the hospital for the whole color scheme of the quilt. And then Casa Vicens, also Gaudi. This was his first house that he designed. And the fragment that I use is the fragment you see in the middle detail. And then I've used it in my lower right of my quilt. But I also wanted you to see a larger view of the building, which you see in the upper top. From Casa Tomas, sunflowers. So sunflowers are ubiquitous in stone sunflowers in balconies, balustrades, and I've used that interrupting the line between São Paulo and Casa Vicens. And finally, Catalan King. Excuse me. Casa Maye is right to the left of the king's head. This was a wealthy chocolatier who commissioned this building. And Casa Bayo has the interior of Casa Bayo merging into a maille, and then also the chimney just above the giant's head. But I also use the 4 cats, El Cuatro Gats, in this. I used the gargoyle from that. Puig y Carapal designed the building, but it's a cafe, and it's a cafe well known for writers, artists, and musicians who gathered there and still gather there today. It's where Picasso had his first solo exhibition. And this is another use of the tower from Casa de los Punches, and it's on the left-hand side of the quilt. And I also wanted you to see the larger view of the building, the wider angle view, because this is the inspiration for Disney's castle from the wide world of Disney. And last, Casa Comalat was influenced by Casa Bayo. So I have that merging into the interior of Casa Bayo. The diamonds in my quilt are from the interior of Casa Bayo. and the window to the sky is Casa, and then the gargoyle is there facing Casa. And that's it for my slides. And I'm going to switch now to end the show. And now I go to the screen. Excuse me while I figure out what to do with this. Stacy, what do I do?
You want to stop sharing your screen at the top.
It says new share. Oh. No, I don't want to do that.
Should be able to just say stop sharing.
So
Oh, I see.
Yep.
I got it. There. Yay.
Great, great. Well, Anna, thank you so much on behalf of all of us for talking a little bit about your project and your quilts and the buildings and the architecture that inspired the work. This is all really exciting to see this. Many of us have seen the quilts in person in the faculty show, and now hearing a little bit more about the source imagery is really revealing. As I was thinking about our conversation today, and you and I had talked a little bit yesterday in preparation, it felt important, at least at the beginning, to acknowledge that so much of your work depends on field research in faraway places. And I was wondering what's going on in your mind, and what are you thinking about these days as that global mobility that both you and other artists and scholars have depended on for so many years is now in an uncertain state, or in a state of flux?
Well, I'm going to be limited with where I go, and I'll have to turn my camera to my neighborhood. So in the short term, I just moved to College Hill in Easton. So in the short term, that's what I'll do next, is the architecture around College Hill here in Easton, Pennsylvania. But it's really concerning that international travel, I don't know when the next time is that I could go somewhere. And even looking through these slides of Barcelona, I'm reminded of an angle that I didn't capture that I would have liked to use in the next montage. When I see my photographs, when I get them back, there's always that angle that wasn't there. Or that viewpoint that I would have liked to have had, or that building I couldn't identify because I forgot to get the whole facade. I only got the detail. And or I forgot to capture the GPS on my iPhone and only got the detail on my my DSLR. And so there, or as new technology happens with a new camera, and I would have had the GPS. Now I could go back and get more information, but I'm limited. I can't go back right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. We'll all be limited. Those of us who work in the field and who work internationally, in particular. So it's a challenging time, of course, for all of us. When you think about source images, and when you're thinking about the sources for your quilts, what is the process by which you decide that you're going to focus, for example, on Barcelona and late 19th century Catalan architecture? What is it that leads you there? How do you begin to make choices about the sites that you'll visit, the types of monuments that you'll photograph? What's the rationale and the thinking that goes into that?
Well, in the case of Barcelona, two sources, I would say. One would be earlier art history classes. Casa was one of the first art history classes I took, my first survey class, and it left a real impression on me back then. And the other was an earlier trip to Barcelona years ago. And when I went then, I took out every art history book I had to put together an itinerary. But I didn't have a project in mind when I went then. So it was with a grant proposal for a faculty research grant that I went this time, and had in mind montages that I wanted to do. So that's usually how it happens, that I've seen the work in some other context first, have been introduced, usually in an academic setting, have traveled to see the work in person, and then go back. So it's usually an opportunity to see the work in person first, and really experience first before taking my camera out.
Great. You know, one of the things that's always been really fascinating to me about your quilts is the attention overall that you place on pattern, which is fundamentally about repetition, right? The repetition of shapes or forms or colors, often abstract ones that kind of unfold and get repeated over and over again. And I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on what pattern means to you in your work, what the attraction is for pattern. Quilts, of course, in their tradition and in their history are very much dependent on pattern repetition, right? So I'm curious to hear a little bit more. I'm sure all of us are, about that.
I'm particularly drawn to patterns that seem to repeat symmetrically but have a break, have some form of asymmetrical break or change. And again, these would have been things that I was introduced to academically, Celtic, Latin, curvilinear designs I was really drawn to. And then when they're pulled into later Cairo carpet pages, they're intensely dense, horror vacui. That's what I'm really drawn to. And then I see the same thing in African Vodun altars or Haitian altars, where it's image upon image and no white space. There's nothing of the table on which the altar is placed that you can see. It's all covered with one fabric upon fabric and sculpture upon sculpture, and it's additive. And the textiles that I'm most interested in have that quality as well. And so what drew me to quilts tended to be those quilts that had that quality too, the ones that have the most dense surface quality to the actual quilting surface design itself, as well as the piecing work. I don't do any piecing work myself, but I have a great amount of respect for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course, Gaudi and his generation, that whole generation of Catalan modernists, they were also, right, intensely interested in pattern and in the decoration of the surface, right? I imagine that must be one of the links between your work and theirs.
Yes, and one of the slides I pulled out so my presentation wouldn't be too long was the interior of Casa, and it was only recently that was open to the public. And the ceiling, the walls, the floors, everything was a different pattern, but harmonious.
Yeah.
So it all works together. There's stucco relief ceilings and wall designs that are also in relief. And the amount of craftsmanship that goes into that work is amazing. And but also the amount of work that had to go into anticipating how these would work together also really struck me as well, because it might not have worked to put all those different patterns together.
Yeah, indeed. Well, when we think about Gaudi's work, there isn't much white space there at all.
No.
Also, that density that you're talking about, space filled up with materials and with texture and with decoration. That's sort of what we associate with that work. It's interesting too that as I was doing a little bit more reading on some of the buildings that you've spoken about, how many of those architects themselves were rather freely appropriating patterns and designs from other cultures, sometimes archaically looking back to Catalan Gothic and Romanesque architecture, but also bringing in patterns from Islamic traditions, from local vernacular traditions. So that idea also, I guess, of bringing in source material from different, sometimes disparate places into one space also seems to be a part of their practice and maybe a part of yours, right?
Yes, very much so part of mine. And where even where I live, when I have in my own neighborhood turned my camera outward, it still feels as though I'm a tourist when I'm shooting. I like to shoot with somebody with me as I'm doing that, because there's still a feeling of awkwardness going around and photographing in someone else's space and turning the camera towards residential places. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in vernacular architecture. And but I do point my camera towards the third floor and above, so at least I'm not pointing in towards where I'm going to see people. So there's a limit, and I'm usually across the street with a long lens instead of a wide lens right in front of the front door. So there are certain limits I place on myself in how I appropriate, and I found those limits along the way, and where my comfort level is and how much I will step into somebody's space and how much I won't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, I mean, we imagine that that's a sensitivity that the modernists of 100 years ago did not have. It's something that we're newly adapting to and thinking about more intensively over the last 20, 30 years, right? The role of the person behind the camera, or the person who is sourcing imagery from another culture, right? In particular, whether it's buildings or people. So it's a different moment that that we're operating in, right? If you were turning the camera on your subjects 100 years ago, you might not share those thoughts, right? You might not have those concerns.
And I like to think that I'm usually turning my camera in a sympathetic way and not in a critical way. So my commentary, I'm not usually, everything has some kind of bias, I suppose, but I like to think that my bias is a sympathetic bias.
Yeah, one of the things I remember us talking about yesterday, right, when we were chatting over the phone, was your idea of not claiming to be a disinterested observer, right, but sort of owning up to the invested position and the all the trappings that come along with that. And that seems like an interesting, nice way of framing this dilemma, right?
Right. right. I have never felt that I do as much research as I can, but I don't feel that I go in as a scientific observer with full objectivity. I go in 1 or 2 feet in, and where I am as much of a participant as I can be.
Mhm.
And if invited, I will be a participant. And that that's what feels more realistic to me. And in the work that I do with Vodun, I do the same thing. I'm more of a participant than I am a distant observer.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Another thing that I was thinking about is a memory I have of my own grandmother embroidering table runners and tablecloths and spending months and months working on these things by hand. And I've been thinking a lot about how you've now moved a lot of this production through digital means to sort of an automated state. And I wonder, where the relationship is or where the balance is between this practice that used to be all about really laborious handwork, right, and piecework, and this new speed and efficiency with which you can operate now with your digital embroidery machines and other technologies like that. Well, what does it mean for a practice that was traditionally associated with handwork to move into the digital realm, to automation?
Well, for me, my practice, the work that I do on the quilting side is all freehand work. I drive the machine. It's called free motion because you walk the machine around the quilt instead of pushing the fabric through a sewing machine. You're walking the machine head around the quilt, and the computer doesn't drive that part. The embroidery, though, I designed for the first quilt that I showed, I designed the leaves, and the leaves were after a pattern that Gaudi did in Casa. And I designed that on the computer, then fed that into a computer that's part of my embroidery machine, and then that was automated. And it is an interesting transition because you can't just let the machine go and not watch it. You've got to watch it for the thread breaking, the needle breaking. Um, uh, Maybe there's too much density and you've got to make an adjustment. So there's always things about automation at the individual level that have to be checked on a machine that is very different from a commercial level automation machine. So it's not at a fully automated level, but it is different than me doing all of that quilting, what I call by hand, because I am driving the machine head around all of that detail in the quilt. I could probably pull one of these up here to show. Is that showing on the screen?
You probably need to bring it closer, but yeah, there we go.
Okay, so all that detail in there. Okay, now I can see all that detail around that design. That's all free-handed, and that's walking the machine around. So that feels very much like by hand, but it's not the same as by hand when you push the needle through and pull it up and push the needle through and pull it up, which I used to do.
Yeah.
But I physically can't do that anymore because I have tremors.
Right.
So the nice thing about working with a machine, long arm machine, is their handlebars, and that's a gross motor skill. So I'm drawing with handlebars.
Mm.
And it very much reminds me of large gestural figure drawing when I was an undergraduate, and life drawing classes when we were told to use our entire arm to draw and not to use our wrists like this to draw. And that's what it feels like. I'm drawing with my whole body, and it feels gestural.
Right. Well, that's great. That's a great image to conclude on. Shall we turn
Leave it
over?
open to questions?
Yeah. Shall we turn things over to our fellow participants and guests?
Yes.
So we have two questions so far. One is from Andrea and another is from Winter. You kind of addressed this a little bit, but how are the quilts made, hand stitched or machine stitched, photo transfer, and why quilts, why not collage? And then Winter had the same kind of question in terms of your construction for the quilts and how you use thread in the creative design of them.
Okay, well, I'll start with why quilts and not collage. I used to do mostly collage, and I was always interested in printing on fabric, but the availability of being able to print on fabric as a one-off, as opposed to printing on having to print 20 yards or something like that. That was only fairly recent that individuals were able to print on fabric. So that was something that just was fairly recent for me in my development, that I was able to print my montages on fabric. But then we had a faculty colloquium in our department, and I showed my silks, and one of my colleagues asked me why I didn't quilt them, and I said, well, I can't hand quilt anymore. My my hands, I have tremors. And he said, well, why not a long arm? And I said, what's a long arm? And a long arm is basically a very large sewing machine with these handlebars that you can do gross motor movements with to move the machine across fabric. But I didn't know that. And so I wrote a grant proposal, and I was funded and bought a long arm. And that's how I came to quilting by machine. And I was told by somebody in a quilt shop, he said, you're kidding. You wrote a grant before you knew how to use a long arm? Nobody does that. Nobody buys a long arm before they know how to use it. Some people can't even long arm at all and never make that transition. So I was incredibly intimidated then. And it took about 3 years to learn. But it feels very natural now. So that's how I got to machine from hand quilting. I did hand quilt back in the 90s. And I did montage back in the 90s on paper. Does that cover all those pieces of those questions?
Yeah, I think you handled that. I think you answered all of those questions. Can you talk a little bit, from Nick Nikolov asked if you could talk a little bit, comment on the tactile qualities of both architecture and quilting, kind of their ability to communicate with textures, and also on the correlation of architectural texture, and I don't even know how to say that word, quilting. Oh, maybe it's supposed to say quilting. Sorry, quilting texture. I thought it was in another language. Are there instances where the relationship determined by the artist and time, and when the relationship is determined by the content to the native material? So why don't you start with, how about talking about the tactile qualities of both architecture and quilting, and I guess kind of the correlation between the two and the back and forth that can happen there?
Well, I think a big one for me is when I pulled the montage together, one of the things that, there's a couple things that I violate. I violate actual scale relationships. So those are gone. Perspective relationships are violated. Light relationships are usually violated. So there are a lot of things in reality that are gone, but they're usually vertically still in the same relationship. So I don't turn one building upside down and place it next to another building that's right side up. So I usually vertically have them in the same relationship to one another. But one thing that I do, once I've created all those violations, texture I'm still really fascinated with. And I look for depth in texture when I'm photographing. So I look for the corbels and cornices and dentils, and I look for tracery, and I look for those details, and I'm usually going to see it on the third floor and higher in some architecture. And now I just am going to completely reverse that and think of Louis Sullivan, and I'm going to see it on the bottom floor. And so it depends on where I am, where I'm going to see that detail. So I'll photograph the detail, and then when I'm quilting, there's one thing that I add, and it's a challenge that ends up that I don't know I've given myself that hard a challenge to do until I start. And that is how I reestablish depth. So when I've placed a small thing in front of a large thing, and then I try to reestablish depth. So I've created a small tower in front of a large tower. Now I have to push that large tower back. How do I do it? I do it with density of my quilting. So I make the quilting very dense in the background and the quilting more lofty in the foreground. It's also called trapunto, so that the foreground stands up from the surface in relief and the background sits back. And when I'm creating the montage, I'm not really thinking about that. I'm thinking about composition. But then when I start quilting, I think, oh, I can't believe I made this challenge for myself. Now I've got to create density behind tracery. And that's really hard to do. And so it's a great challenge. I really enjoy working with depth that way to create texture. It's a good question. Thank you.
So we have some insider information from your son.
Yeah.
Read the aforementioned participating in local culture and being asked in a wedding in Israel to make bread with women from St. Joseph's altar. And most recently, when you were in Austria with an unplanned rare tour of a castle from 1192, and kind of photography in those cultures at events and bringing an authentic quality to your work. How do those experiences change your approach in your work as opposed to not having an invitation?
Well, here's a good example. I was given permission to photograph Mardi Gras Indians in their parade. Their costumes are called suits. They make a new suit every year. And to get a good shot, you have to stand right in front of someone. And I would ask, but it still felt very confrontational to stand right in front of someone to get that good shot of the whole suit. But I wrote an article, and the article was about Mardi Gras Indians wanting to copyright the photography of their suits because their suits should be copyrighted. And I then just didn't feel comfortable after that. I had shown my photographs once or twice, actually in the Lehigh gallery, I had shown one of the photographs. But after that point, I didn't feel comfortable anymore. I felt uninvited to show those photographs. And I didn't pursue that line of inquiry any further. I felt as if that was an example of an artist who, even though they were in public and I had every legal right in a public street to photograph them, they had expressed a desire not to have their photographs published. And so I felt uninvited. And that was a good example of something that I then distanced myself from doing. So feeling invited, making the bread, being part of cooking the cookies in the St. Joseph's altars, being invited to come in and have some of the food the day before. You get to know the people and the labor that goes into making these altars. The one altar I participated in was half the size of a gymnasium floor. So if you think of a gymnasium in that size, it was all food. And it was a huge altar designed to feed the poor, as a devotion to St. Joseph. So it means a lot to be invited.
And we can see that in your work too. Well, we're nearing the end of our time here. People are still welcome to post some questions here. Winter had another. Do you participate in the piecing of the fabric? And how do you select the fabrics that you work with?
I print my fabric. I design the montage in Photoshop from all my photographs. So my piecing is actually done on the computer from about anywhere from 25 to 75 photographs. And so that's my piecing. It's digital. The cloth itself is whole cloth. It's one piece of cloth that's made to look as though it's pieced, but it's not pieced. It's sent out to be printed on fabric digitally. So it's dyed. They're fabric dyes. It's permanent. It can be washed, although I don't wash my quilts. And so it's a whole cloth quilt.
And I'm sure very process intensive.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for sharing your process with us and expertise, both to you and to Nicholas Sawicki. We're so grateful for this opportunity to take a creative break from what's going on in the world. This will be one of hopefully a series of dialogues that we will be posting on our website shortly at www.luag.org. We're also working on virtual workshops and resources for people. So please check back often with us, visit our website. We have a wonderful digital collection as well as an overview of the art, architecture, and design exhibition at our website, where you can see these works as well as works from other faculty in the AAD department. So please check back often, please participate, keep yourself creative and active, and thank you all so much for your time today, and especially to Anna and to Nicholas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.